very much my mood.
Oh, hello.
So cute. It looks like the dog's talking.
Sometimes it feels like she is. Oh, Caroline? Is it Carolyn?
It's Caroline.
Oh, Caroline. It's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. We're going to get started in just a few minutes here. Just some people are trickling in from the waiting room, so I want to keep an eye on that. While we're waiting, maybe everyone could throw in the chat if they've been to one of our imposter syndrome events before and where they're tuning in from. I'm always curious to see where we have folks from. I'm in Victoria, BC. Anyone else from Victoria?
From Victoria as well.
Halifax, nice. Other side. Another Victorian, woo. Oh, a couple.
Yay, Toronto.
We're getting a fair bit more East Coasters as well, which is very cool.
Yeah, really nice to see. We've had Brooklyn, that's really cool. We've had a couple people at previous events from the UK, some people from Ireland, different parts of the States. Cool. Okay, there's still people trickling in, so I'm just going to keep an eye on that, but we can get started. Miriam, I've just made you a co-host, so if you see anyone else coming into the waiting room, you can admit them. But welcome everyone to our third event in the Imposter Syndrome Series. We're super excited to have Anne here today. But in the meantime, I just wanted to give a brief introduction to Lighthouse Labs and the Career Accelerator program. So for those of you who don't know, Lighthouse Labs is a tech education company specializing in data and web development programs for people who want to pivot their careers into technologies. On top of our industry-driven curriculum, we also offer career services to all of our bootcamp students to help them navigate their careers in technology. As an institution that works with career changers, especially in the midst of a pandemic, imposter syndrome is a term that comes up quite often in our day-to-day. The Career Accelerator was launched amidst the pandemic to provide support for those who are navigating unexpected career interruptions. Some of you in the audience might be able to relate to that. To do so, we're leveraging 7+ years of experience helping people break into the tech industry alongside industry partners like Dyspatch, who are here with us today, to provide the most relevant career information from on the ground in technology. If you have any questions about Lighthouse Labs programs or career services, please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or send me an email at caroline.lauder@lighthouselabs.com, which I'll throw in the chat. And then just before we get started, a couple housekeeping things. Number one, just keep yourself muted throughout the duration of the conversation. And secondly, we are going to be recording this event. So if you do turn your cameras and your mics on, you may be on screen and recorded. So just keep that in mind. We will be monitoring the chat to make sure that all of your questions get answered, and there'll be about 15 minutes at the end for you to ask whatever questions you have. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Miriam and Anne to get things started.
Hello, everyone. My name is Miriam. I am an engineering manager at Dyspatch, which is an email production platform. We're really happy to be partnering with Lighthouse Labs on this series. It's been a lot of fun in the past, and we're really excited to keep it going. So joining us today, we have Anne Thomas, who we're really looking forward to chatting to. Anne has spent the past 12 years immersed in the wonderful world of web development as a front-end developer, and can be found offering comprehensive Shopify store audits with a talented team at Shop Critique. Previously, she's worked at large advertising agencies, small development shops, and government organizations, and most recently was technical director at Out of the Sandbox. She also has a love of teaching and has taught part-time web development and JavaScript programs at Juno College in Toronto. So welcome, Anne.
Thanks. So excited to be here.
Likewise. So just to start off, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you describe imposter syndrome in your own words.
Yeah, imposter syndrome. It's sort of this big thing, isn't it? I would say for me personally, when I think of imposter syndrome, what I think of is that feeling that you don't actually know what you're doing and you're sort of making it up as you're going along. And that feeling that you shouldn't have the confidence in your own ideas or opinions because somewhere, someone is going to tell you that you aren't worth listening to. And then that feeling that no matter how long you work or how hard you try, you'll never be as good as this person or that person. It's just that like nagging feeling that everything you've accomplished is somehow like a fluke. And honestly, it's the feeling that you aren't qualified to talk about imposter syndrome. So, yeah.
The meta imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
I think we've been finding that. That's one of the unlikeliest and kind of funniest forms of it, and I can definitely relate to that as well. There's been a lot of really great examples of people that have come out and talked about it as well. I've chatted about this in past imposter syndrome events, but we have examples from as far-reaching as like Albert Einstein and Maya Angelou who have said like, I'm afraid I'm going to be found out. And for us, that's really funny to look at because we think that's ridiculous. But yeah, it just goes to show how far-reaching it is. I think in my research, I found that in the studies that have been done, it supposedly affects about 70% of people. So definitely not a personal issue for folks and something that we should be talking about. As I mentioned in my brief summary of the great things you've done over the last 12 years, you have worked in a lot of different organizations. So I was wondering if you found that imposter syndrome has changed with the different roles and organizations that you've been in.
I would say so. Yeah. I mean, because imposter syndrome to me is sort of this funny thing where, you know, it's almost, I feel like in some ways I almost had less imposter syndrome earlier in my career because I almost didn't know what I didn't know kind of thing. And sort of the longer that I was a developer and this kind of thing, and I see all these other incredible things people are doing, I'm like, oh wow. And you just start, you know, doubting what you've done and what you've accomplished. I would say that it's changed in the way that I think when I first started as well, I was really afraid to ask questions because I thought that would appear that, you know, I didn't know everything. And if I was asking questions, then, you know, someone would say like, oh, well, you know, she clearly doesn't know what she's doing because she's asking so many questions. Whereas I found nowadays, you know, people that I've worked with, that's my favorite thing is when people are asking questions, and I try now to ask lots of questions, but it's definitely a skill to learn. You know, I've had scenarios where, again, I've been working somewhere and say, oh, I'm a web developer. And they say, oh, you look more like a designer, you know, that sort of classic. And so you immediately sort of feel that, well, maybe I should be a designer. I mean, I don't look like a developer and this kind of thing. I found that what ended up happening in a lot of the different roles and organizations is that this idea that I somehow wasn't good enough led to a lot of unpaid overtime because I would just always be trying to prove myself. And so I didn't really think I was always worth my salary. So I would always try and, you know, I'd be getting praise from my managers, but I just never thought it was enough. So with all of those journeys, one of the things is the teaching. So I had the opportunity to teach part-time at HackerU, which is now Juno College. And that was like this huge revelation for me, because just being in front of the classroom, it sort of automatically gave me that credibility. And what I found is that if I tried to, use too much jargon or come across as being, oh, I'm up here and you're down here and this kind of thing, and I really know what I'm talking about, it really backfired. Because a lot of times the students are like, well, that doesn't make any sense to me, or what have you. And so making mistakes when I was up in the front of the classroom, it really humanized me, I think. And it sort of made me realize, like, oh, okay, you don't have to appear perfect all the time. So now that I'm back doing consulting work for Shopify merchants, I'm finding that it's a slippery slope to backslide into those tendencies where you're trying to be an expert all the time and you always know what you're talking about. So I would say that's sort of how things have happened with my relationship with imposter syndrome.
There's so many cool things that you mentioned there that I'd love to unpack. I think I definitely relate a lot to people kind of telling you what they expect you to be, and then sort of having to be defensive for what you do and almost putting more pressure on yourself. And I think it's really interesting that you mentioned that as a teacher, you came at it from a completely different perspective. So I actually wanted to know, in your career in education, did you ever see imposter syndrome in your students? And do you think there's anything that educators can do to better equip their students to handle those kinds of feelings?
Yeah, I saw it all the time. I think one of the things that people often do when they're learning a new, like web development, JavaScript, a new sort of language in general, is they compare themselves to other people. And so if you feel like you're not getting it right away, and then you see that someone else in the classroom is like, oh, flying through it and it's totally easy for them, then you start thinking like, oh, maybe I shouldn't be here. Maybe I will never get it, right? And it's that trying to get people over that hurdle of thinking that they'll never get there. And that's sometimes a tricky thing to do, because what I've also learned through teaching is that you can't magically bestow confidence on someone. And I've also had to learn that myself, is that you can't sort of give that to someone. That's something that they kind of have to do their own journey and get to. So as much as you can help with, praise and encouragement and that kind of thing, that's such an external motivator, and people really have to find that internal motivator to get to the point that they need to.
That is so true. So kind of bouncing around to what you're doing nowadays and in your career as a director, what's your perspective as a leader in tech? How do you think businesses and other leaders can build a culture that combats imposter syndrome? Because I find that a lot of these things, at least based off of the feedback that I get, it sounds like it's pretty systemic. So like it's baked into ways of working, and it's baked into the way meetings run, and kind of like those unspoken rules around who can say what things. Do you have any advice on that?
Yeah, it's really tricky, especially if you have, I worked in a lot of various different organizations where, when I was right out of school, for instance, I worked with a government organization and I was the only web developer on the team. So that was terrifying, but also fairly confidence building at the same time, because yes, I was worried about, oh, someone's going to find out, but at the same time, my manager didn't really know much about web development, so I didn't have to worry so much. But then my next job was at this advertising agency, and there were a lot of other senior developers and this kind of thing, so there was a lot more pressure and this kind of stuff. So I think that, to me, fostering a sense of sort of team camaraderie is huge. And so what I mean by that is not necessarily like, oh, team lunches and this kind of thing. It's more about making sure that everyone on the team, from your manager to senior developers to junior developers, they're able to open up about stupid mistakes and not feel like you have to maintain this sort of, oh, everything I do is the right thing, and this kind of, you want to make sure that people are able to really feel comfortable and confident in, talking to their manager about problems that they're having, and just having that sort of safe space, I guess, to be able to do their best work. I think something else that I've seen work quite well to combat imposter syndrome in businesses is allowing people that are more junior on your team to have ownership about on things. So whether that's a feature, whether that's part of the process, it's really saying like, yes, be giving people that opportunity to be like, all right, I trust you to know what to do with this. Go for it. I'm gonna, I have confidence in you to be able to achieve that. And I think that can really help a lot of times.
That's great. And that might translate a little bit more into my next question. So I was thinking a bit about how you spoke about your experiences and kind of being put into a box by people. It's natural that there are going to be some people that are a little bit more marginalized in tech, and the dream is that we have more women in tech and we have more diverse people in tech. But of course, they kind of face their own flavors of imposter syndrome, whether it's overt or like implicit barriers or people actually stepping in their way. Do you have any advice for people that are marginalized and getting started in tech, or whether they've been in tech for a while, something that might help them navigate their career with like all of these kind of systemic barriers?
Yeah, for sure. I think that following, like trying to sort of seek out people who have been in the industry longer, to really, so whether that's on Instagram or Twitter or what have you, just finding those like supportive community environments. So whether that's like joining Facebook groups or Slack groups and that kind of thing, and just being able to find, not necessarily like, yes, mentoring is fantastic, and having a mentor and having mentees. I find it's often difficult to find that sort of like, oh, I'm looking for a mentor. I think a better approach oftentimes is finding a community. So finding other people who have sort of shared experiences and this kind of thing, you can bounce ideas off of each other. And then that way, again, it's that realization that like, oh, other people are also struggling with the same thing that I am, and kind of getting advice and sharing and that kind of thing. I think also that goes along with what I was talking about before with asking questions, right? So not being afraid to reach out to people, to quote unquote network. But yeah, just being okay with putting yourself out there. But I know that's a really scary thing sometimes, because it's that sort of admission that, oh, I need help, and I need sort of that community, which is tough.
Yeah, that's totally true. And I think you touched on something that that would speak to a lot of people, which is like just asking questions or just reaching out to people. In my experience, I found that in way more cases than not, people genuinely want to help. So if you just reach out to someone, likely they'll either get you in touch with someone that can help you, or they'll answer your questions, or they might just engage a little bit, and then you have a little ally on your side. It is daunting to start doing that, but I think that's something that everyone, especially in the current situation where you have time and you can just send some people messages on LinkedIn, everyone can hopefully start actioning on things like that.
It is, honestly, it is fully terrifying. Like, let's not, it is a scary thing to do. I would say if you are reaching out to people and that kind of thing, always make sure that if you're reached out and they sort of message you back, make sure that you also message them back. Like, don't, if there's a conversation there and that kind of thing, do your side of that as well. And also just throwing that out there, if anyone wants to message me on LinkedIn, I will message you back. Like, it's, it is definitely a scary thing to do. Yeah.
For sure. So just changing gears, this one has a little bit of a lead up. So there's often a sense that individuals who have had great success in their field, like yourself, wouldn't have feelings of self-doubt. But the research actually shows the opposite. In fact, high achievers tend to have imposter syndrome due to the lack of having peers that they can relate to, as well as battling their own expectations for themselves. And it kind of leads to people overworking themselves and burning out, kind of like you mentioned. So what can you tell us about how you balance maintaining a level head and other people's perceptions of you versus the reality of day-to-day life?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's funny because, obviously before coming on and doing this, I, of course, did a ton of research into imposter syndrome to make sure, I was like, okay, I gotta make sure I know exactly what I'm talking about, this kind of thing. And one of the things is sort of that inability to accept praise. Like it makes you feel uncomfortable. Like, no. Like that was, so even hearing you say that, like, ooh, ugh. So I would say that one of the things that I do with trying to, when I have those feelings, is with social media, for example. I don't really post that much on social media, except Twitter. I do go on Twitter quite a bit. But even with Twitter, I find that sometimes I'll write out a tweet and then I'll delete it because it's sort of, like, oh, who cares what I think, or that sounds too negative. I don't want to be viewed as a negative person. And it's this kind of constant battle between, hey, like just live your life. That's okay. You can do that. You can live your life versus, oh, someone's going to call you out and say, like, you don't know what you're talking about, you shouldn't be speaking on this topic, etc., kind of thing. And it's interesting because I find that, even chatting with everyone here and this kind of thing, I get a lot more nervous doing things like this than I would with a technical talk, because it's sort of, it's a lot more exposed, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like one of the topics of conversation is your experience, so it can be nerve-wracking. So we've talked a little bit about what individuals can do if they're struggling with imposter syndrome, or if they're from a marginalized group of people and they're struggling with systemic barriers. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to who you think has the responsibility in dismantling the construct of imposter syndrome. So that can be individuals kind of taking action, reaching out to people on LinkedIn, but could it also be families and your socialization, organizations, industry, bigger than that? There's a lot of different layers to it, and I just want to hear your perspective.
Yeah, it's a big question. It's a very big question for sure. And I think that there's a lot that everyone can be doing for themselves, but also just for their community in general, and making sure that, we are trying to, I think the important thing is that, I think certain people for sure are more predisposed to have the feeling of imposter syndrome. But as you mentioned before, I think the statistic was 70% of people. That's a lot of people. So events like this are really great because they help recognize that, I might have imposter syndrome, but it doesn't need to define you as a person. It can also come and go, I think. But it would be fantastic if there was more, I guess, discussion and acknowledgement of, how it can affect your relationships, how it can affect your job. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. So I just want to dive a little bit deeper into kind of the industry level. What do you think members of the tech community who haven't come up through the traditional path can do to combat forces that make them feel like they don't belong? So I actually don't think that you spoke a little bit about your path into tech. Maybe that'll be a good segue into this. But something that I've found that is more and more relevant, especially in the world of web development, is you will have people that came up the super traditional way of getting into software. That's the way that I got into software, and it actually weirdly doesn't help you with imposter syndrome either, in my opinion. But I have also come across people that are very gatekeepy, and they will kind of make people that have either started up themselves or done a boot camp kind of make them feel like their contributions aren't as valid. And it's something that's really tough to wrestle with, because sometimes, you might have someone who's like a great technical architect and their contributions will be valid, but it's kind of, the worry is that it hinders growth. Is there anything that you might be able to suggest that leaders or the community in general can take away to maybe improve things for the future there?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I think that you're totally right in that that there's sort of there's multiple different ways to get to web development or any career really. But I think that, so I have a degree in art history, so just to throw that out there. So I went to school for art history, and I went back to school for a postgraduate certificate. But it's interesting too, because in a way, sometimes I feel like I need to catch myself from also being sort of gatekeeping, because sometimes I'll mention like, oh, Flash and this kind of thing. And I have to try, I try to like, oh, I've been around for a while and this kind of thing, because I think there's a part of me that's still sort of like, oh, I don't have a computer science degree. And so I need to kind of have that a little bit. So it's interesting you pointed that, because I was like, oh yeah, I sometimes do that too. But I would say that myself personally, as far as an organization and what I've always looked for when hiring and that kind of thing, I would 100% rather work with someone who has a good attitude, who's curious, tenacious, and optimistic, rather than someone who is a gatekeeping jerk who thinks they know everything. Like, it's in terms of, software is something like web development is something that anyone really can learn with enough time and practice and this kind of thing. It's not like ballet where you need to have this sort of, or I'm sure anyone could do ballet, but at a certain level, it really is a language and a skill that someone, as long as you work at it long enough, you can achieve a certain level. So personally, I think that attitude is a lot more important. And so I think organizations, boot camps have now become so just standard, ubiquitous. I'm not sure of the word I'm looking for here, but when I went way back in the day to do Flash, I had to do a postgraduate certificate. I would have preferred a boot camp. Like, had I been able to transport in time, I definitely would have been a boot camp student. So I've seen it in the industry where people are like, oh, boot camp grads, I wouldn't hire them, and this kind of thing. Honestly, when I worked out of the Sandbox, we had wonderful amounts of boot camp grads, and they were all fantastic. And I've heard nothing but good things about them. So for me, I've never sort of, and especially teaching at a boot camp, I just see a lot of times people that are going to a boot camp or that are self-taught, they might have had a previous career beforehand. And so when they make that switch, it's almost like they have more like a broader context to the development work that they're doing, as opposed to, oh, I'm building this widget. They often think more about the why the widget is being built versus just how am I going to build it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you have any advice maybe for folks who are dealing with that kind of an organizational level? Maybe like they've already got a team that they think is great, but they're just not adapting well to taking on either someone at a junior level or someone that's just a bit different than them.
So is the advice for the manager or the person who's unfortunately being put in that position?
I think I'd be interested in getting advice for people that are in leadership and in a position to make a change, because oftentimes for events like these, I think there's a lot of interest from people who are experiencing these things themselves. But I also think it's just as important for people who might not be directly dealing with these things in their career, but they are in a position to combat it and hopefully change things for the better for other people.
Yeah, definitely. I think it was a year ago now, I did a talk at this conference called Web Unleashed, and it was learning leadership. So I had been put in, I was managing a team, and I needed to, and I was just was struggling with sort of this, okay, I'm a leader now, I'm a manager, how do I actually do this? And so I just talked to a bunch of people who were in leadership positions at different companies and this kind of thing. And my biggest takeaway was, I guess, empathy, but also actively learning how, like, you're no longer a developer. Really, you need to lean into being a manager and learning how leadership and how, people ops and this kind of thing. Because I think that's a common thing in development teams, especially where you might have someone who gets, what's the word I'm looking for? Someone who becomes a manager, just because they're the best developer on the team, which isn't necessarily such a good thing. And so what that person, if they do find themselves in that situation, they need to really figure out what it means to be a good manager and make sure that they're going to properly support the people on their team and no longer be worried so much about the actual development, but more about the people on their team. And I think that's like a piece that, you know, is sometimes missing. I really recommend two books actually that were really fantastic for me when I first started doing management was the Manager's Path by Camille Fournier, and then I can't remember the name of it. Julie Zhao from Facebook has a really good one. Yeah.
I'll look it up later. I'm sure everybody else will too. That's great. Thanks so much for that. So a little bit more to what I think a lot of people deal with just because of our current environment. We live in a society where we tell people to find their passion, and if you find jobs you love, you'll never work a day in your life, all that stuff. And I think to an extent, this is something that's really exacerbated by social media and kind of seeing everybody else's highlight reel, and whether those things are true or not is kind of up for debate. But can you talk a little bit about why these sentiments can be dangerous and how they might contribute to feeling alienated or ultimately feeling imposter syndrome?
Yeah, for sure. I think this was put into stark contrast for me when I remember I was talking to a class, and I was sort of talking about like, the different, things I've done in my career, this kind of thing. And then someone in the class, they asked, they're like, but what if we just want like a job as like a web developer? Like, is that okay? Like, it seems like you're like, this is your entire lifelong kind of thing. And it sort of made me stop and think like, yes, of course that's okay. Like, yes, this does not, like, my sister is in sales, and it isn't this job requirement that she has to have a side hobby of selling in order to be perceived as being good at her job. That is not something that it exists. It's this weird thing in tech where, for some reason there's this idea that you have to be coding 24/7 in order to be a real developer and this kind of thing. And I think that there's a balance for sure where, if you're just starting off in the industry and you're at a job and you don't maybe understand something and you're not being given the time to work on it necessarily, that's okay if you want to take on like a side project or whatever to really learn that concept. I think that's okay. But if it shouldn't be the expectation that you're going to be doing that for the rest of your life, and every single weekend you're going to be working on your open source software project and this kind of thing. And it is 100% possible to have balance. And I think that's actually going back to that question about management and what they can do to really help that is to make sure, and if you have someone on your team who you can tell has imposter syndrome and is always, working overtime and is working weekends and, they're really sort of pushing themselves for that perfection, like, save them from themselves, help them, have conversations with them and say like, notice that you've been putting in just help save them from themselves essentially, because there can be that tendency where people, take it too far. And I think that if there is that expectation that, if you love your job, you'll never work a day in your life. That's not true. I love what I'm doing right now, and I can still get burnout. Like, it's a dangerous path to go down.
Oh, that is for sure. I think it's a really weird thing in tech that you touched on, which is like, especially in startups, which like, I have a whole thing with startups in general. I feel like every company, Facebook would still call themselves a startup, I feel like. And people kind of get into this mode where they feel like if you work longer hours, then somehow that's correlating to better job prospects or a promotion and all of those things. And I definitely think some companies don't do enough to really identify that and say like, this is a job. You are paid for your time. This doesn't need to be your life.
Not only not recognize it, some of them actively encourage it and want that. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, yeah. And the thing where it gets kind of dangerous is I've actually worked in places where people are openly commended for that. And what that does is it makes people feel like that's the expectation. And this colleague of yours is working so hard, so why aren't you? And if you do, then maybe the CEO will give you credit and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that would go a long way for actually combating making people feel like they need to, I guess, dedicate their life to this job, because there's not that many other jobs where you kind of it needs to be your favorite hobby and also your career.
Yeah.
I don't know that many doctors that do that.
And no one is saying don't be good at your job. Like no one's saying just sort of like, okay, punch in, punch out, you know, don't care. Like, you know, it's great to have people that feel ownership and care about their job, but you can definitely tip over into caring too much.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that managers can definitely play a part in helping to combat. And I think a big part of it is in hiring. I've started to get red flags from companies that kind of their first question is like, where are your open source contributions and where are your side projects and all those things. And that really shouldn't be a qualification for being qualified for a job. Okay, so I think I have one more, and then I want to hand off for audience Q&A, if that sounds good. Just a final fun one. What would you tell your past self or someone else who's just getting into tech and struggling with feeling like an outsider?
Ask more questions. Definitely. I would go back and tell myself that. I still tell myself that daily. It doesn't have to be perfect. I had an old boss and he was very big on sort of, you know, it should be good. It doesn't have to be perfect. Done is better than perfect. The nice thing about web development is you can always go back and refactor. You know, it's not like print where you get one shot. You can always go back and change that code. And I guess one thing for myself, I would say, and I don't know if this helps for anyone else, but I guess just the idea that, you know, not everyone has to like you and not everyone has to believe in you. But it helps a lot if you can like yourself and believe in yourself. I don't know, that sounds cheesy, but yeah.
Cheesy things usually have a lot of value, and I think that's why they're kind of traditional. So great to hear. So with that, I will hand off to audience questions. So if you have any questions that came up during this chat, or you want to think about some now, just drop them right into the chat. I think we have one from Rebecca already, which is, how do you answer those questions about side projects, open source, etc. in interviews?
I would say my tactic is always to go with, oh, I've had this idea. So because you can talk about an idea all you want. You don't necessarily have to send them to, you know, a specific GitHub repo or anything like that. I think sometimes my interpretation as a manager, why I would ask that question is just to kind of think about, you know, to see if people have a little bit of quote unquote outside interest, even though I know it's still, they're looking for code related stuff. But just that, you know, that you're thinking about different projects and ideas, but I think side projects, open source, etc. To me, I think it'd be really interesting if someone had a side project that wasn't even necessarily development related, but it was something maybe like problem solving, or showed that, you know, they had, whether it's like volunteer work or something where they had a dedication to something, or something you do with your kids. Yeah, something along those lines.
I think that's a really good answer. If anyone cares about my answer, because I've gotten that question before, and I've also been in situations where other people have asked that in interviews that I've been a part of. I actually think that there's a lot to standing your ground and saying, I think that I know my domain well enough that this interview process should be able to highlight that. Like, ultimately, it's up to the interviewer to be asking questions about your experience in a way that really surfaces those things. Like, you don't need to be aggressive about it, but you can say, I'm efficient enough and relevant enough in the work that I do day to day, and I can speak to the projects that I worked on in my career or in my academics. It shouldn't be something that anyone gets really stringent on. As far as I know, I haven't had people really hammer me about it. And I think like my final note is like maybe just being really confident in your experience. And some of that is just like making sure that you know your experience really well, so that when you're telling the story, it makes a lot of sense. Because all they're really looking for is you to sell something that they need, which is security in you being able to do your job, and then being able to set expectations for you. So if anybody has any questions about interviewing, you can reach out to me after. I'll share my LinkedIn.
That's great.
Yeah, any other? Cheers. I'm just checking to see if there's any other questions that anyone had. I think Jason asked if we were going to be offering other installments in the series again. We haven't actually talked about that yet, but we do have recordings for them. So if you're interested, we can share those. And then I know we had a lot of great conversations before, so we might invite either those people back, or we might have like people with similar experience back. So we had a CTO last time, we might have a CTO again, that kind of thing. So we have another one, which is, how do you overcome the fear of applying to jobs with 1 million required qualifications that you may not have yet?
Yeah, yes. I would say that one of the things that, can be helpful is also just that, again, that the sort of community of developers that you're going to meet in your boot camp, and also, lean on the network of Lighthouse Labs or whatever boot camp you're graduating from, or what have you. I would say the fear of applying to jobs, though, is that honestly, I would say that a good cover letter, I know that there's this weird thing where people are like, oh, people don't read cover letters in this company. I will tell you, it is wrong. I mean, I hired someone just this past year, and I read every single cover letter, and it's so easy to tell when someone just like puts the exact same cover letter out to every single job. You're like, oh, you're not telling, like, why do you want, I think in a cover letter, for me, it's like, why are you specifically applying to this? Like, why do you care about this company? Like, why are you applying to that one versus this other one? Even if you're applying to both, like, make it seem a little more tailored for each. For me, that makes a big difference as well. When you look at that list of qualifications, you don't have to hit 100% of all of those. That is like a wish list that people put out there. They're like, oh, this amazing candidate exists. That amazing candidate very rarely exists. If you hit, what is it, like 50 to 70% of the qualifications, but a really tailored cover letter with a resume that's going to highlight what is reflected in the job posting, which I know was a lot of work to do for all of these, but that's why using your network is really great too. Sorry, sort of rambled there, but hopefully that was helpful.
Totally. I was actually going to say the same. My number one advice to people is, do not hit easy apply on LinkedIn, especially if you're kind of feeling like you don't meet all of the requirements. If you're already kind of unsure, and you're unsure in yourself, then a recruiter might look at that and think like, oh, well, this person, whatever I'm seeing here is all this person has to offer. I'll also say that whoever says that people don't read cover letters is wrong. And for the people that don't read cover letters, they're not really interested in hiring great people, because it's an investment on both sides. And I will say that some of the most valuable hires that I've had in my career have been from people that have basically had these dream cover letters and actually always executed on them. It shows that people care, and it makes you want to think twice about them and invest in them, because they're already invested in what you're doing. So that's huge. And +1 to, you definitely don't need to have all of the qualifications for a job. If it's specifically in software, as long as you know a language and you know how to write tests, everything in tech should be pretty agnostic to that. So just sell that and talk a little bit about your experience, and it will be translatable, I promise. So, okay, we have a few more things here. So we have something from Tom. You mentioned seeking out a community of developers for not quite mentorship to help combat marginalization and added imposter syndrome. Can come from that. Can you share any resources to access the community? So they mentioned they've heard of YYJ Ladies and the Tech Slack, so that's specifically here in Victoria. Do you have any resources that you might be able to share for networking or mentorship or just any kind of community?
Yeah, for sure. So I would say one of the very tiny small silver linings of COVID is that there's now virtual meetups like this. So I've attended like Women Who Code UK. Like I just pop in, I'm like, hello, I'm from Canada. And they're all so nice. And honestly, you can meet all these like random people all around the world and this kind of thing. It's fantastic. So hopping on Twitter or just like Googling for different hashtags, going on meetup.com again. A lot of people use that, and you don't have to put your location. You know, you could look for anywhere in the world, and it's really fantastic. Yeah, there's different Slack groups. Women in Tech is a really great one, actually, if you're women or non-binary identified, and that's actually run by our co-founder at Shop Critique, Jess, as well as some other people. I can definitely, there's other ones that I'm sure, oh, yep, Jess posted that, fantastic, hello Jess. And I would, the one last thing that I wanted to say actually about the sort of network and that kind of thing, if you have done a program, whether it's computer science, whether it's boot camp or whatever, keep in contact with those people, because the junior developer of today is the CTO of tomorrow. And if you just sort of keep in touch with everyone, it's amazing. Like, honestly, I look at my LinkedIn now, I'm like, I remember when we both didn't know what arrays were. This is fantastic. So it's just kind of cool to see how everyone progresses in their career, and you just kind of, or they might go to different industries, and yeah, just stay in touch with people.
I totally agree. I've been so impressed to see how quickly people come up as well. It's really awe-inspiring. My other advice for people who are looking for events like that and reaching out to people after, I really think if it's been like something where there's a talk or anything where people are discussing things and you want to find out more, definitely reach out with specific comments or questions, because kind of like with applying for jobs, someone who you might find interesting, like 100 other people might have found them interesting too, and they might just get like 100 messages saying, will you be my mentor? But if you want them to invest in you, they also likely want to see some investment from you as well. So just even a comment to say what you liked about what they said or what spoke to you is huge. Another question we have, which I think is so relevant, was someone asked, they've been struggling with whether they have imposter syndrome, because what they're wondering is, what if I really am an imposter? Do you have any advice about that?
Oh, I think that is, I mean, so struggling with imposter syndrome because you're like, I really am the imposter, that it's not a syndrome, like I really am. I mean, this is the thing, is that imposter syndrome, I think, can be a double-edged sword, because you often have these feelings of self-doubt and, I'm worthless and I have to, work so hard and that kind of thing. And again, it's a double-edged sword, because on the other hand, because you feel that way, you often keep trying and pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing, maybe a bit more than you should. So I think that it's good to be self-aware, but not self-destructive, right? So that's sometimes when it can help to talk to like family or friends or a career coach or counselor or that kind of thing, and get some outside perspective, because a lot of times you're not able to, you might feel like you're a total imposter, but that might just be also your self-talk. So sometimes don't trust yourself completely if that's the road you're going down. Get a second opinion first.
I totally agree. I actually think that something that's probably healthy to remind yourself is it's almost impossible to be a true imposter. And the reason is it's not like we're really working in an industry where, and this goes to every industry, you're always capable of learning things and getting feedback and getting better. So you might find that you have areas that you need to grow in, and that doesn't actually mean that you're an outsider or you need to give up and do something else. It just means like ask people that like your managers or your mentor or your peers for feedback, actionable feedback. The requests I've gotten for actionable feedback from my own team have been amazing, and I've actually seen people soar within weeks of getting feedback. So taking that to heart and really putting a lot of effort into it it's really hard to be unsuccessful it's really hard to be unsuccessful if you're actioning on feedback that's about you. So that would be my advice. Let me just see if there's anything else. Does anybody have any other questions that they want to get out for our last 10 minutes? I'm just quickly looking over at the chat. Also, feel free to unmute and ask if you prefer. Okay. Anything else that you might have wanted to ask, Caroline?
I just put in the chat that I know there are some recent grads from the Lighthouse program here, and I know they have questions, but are maybe not asking. So no, I think that was really great. There was a lot of information out there. There's one more question that just came up. Any advice for people venturing into the freelance world and feeling that like they don't know who to sell themselves to for potential clients?
Ooh, Laura, it's a tough one. Laura's my co-founder at Shop Critique. Throw me a curveball. I would say that, that freelance is difficult sometimes, but it oftentimes what can work with freelance, especially when you're first starting out and trying to reach those potential clients, is to find a specific niche. So if you try to be a developer for every person kind of thing, then it's sort of like that thing where, if you're looking for a job, you're like, oh, I'll do anything. It's kind of hard to sometimes find employment. So if you are more specific about the type of freelance work that you want to be doing, and niche, like a specific niche, then you can oftentimes target and sell yourself a lot easier, because you know what your field of expertise is, you know that what you have to offer, kind of thing. Or you can always like sort of start a bit broader and then really niche down. But I would say niching is a good way to go for freelance, I've found.
Great. So we actually got another one just as you were answering that, which is someone felt that they got imposter syndrome during their boot camp for web development because they felt like they were behind. And they have a second interview coming up next week, which is very exciting. Congratulations. Do you have any advice for them?
I would say that make sure that you're well prepared. So, make sure that you know about the company that you're interviewing with. If you have the job posting, look at the types of, stack that they're using, read up on those if you're unfamiliar with any of that. And I would say some of the best advice that I got about, is this for public speaking, but I think it really works for interviews as well, is it's so cliche. Be yourself. Don't try to be funnier than you are. Don't try to be more serious than you are. You want to come across as how you would be working in that environment, and be on your authentic self in the interview. And I think people can usually tell that. So always make sure that you're prepared, and you know the company, but also just be yourself. Yeah.
100%. I actually, I love when people ask about interviewing because it's such a practice game. For technical interviews, I think something that was useful for me early in my career when I was really nervous for interviews was I would actually just write a story for everything that I've done. I would just write a long story about my career in technology, and then I would learn that really well. And that way, the thing that made me do this was oftentimes people go to an interview and they get asked a question that they haven't actually heard before, or they thought they would answer a certain way, or they get a follow-up and you kind of freeze and you don't know what to say. When you kind of have your story written down and memorized, you can always pick out pieces of that actually apply to that question. Feel free to ask for clarification, or even asking for a second or a minute to think about your answer is nothing to be ashamed of. It actually makes you seem insightful and thoughtful. And also, finally, just if you truly don't know how to answer a question, they just ask you something that you literally never heard of before, try to offer something up. So you can always say, I don't know about that specific technology that you're talking about, But you might say, if they ask a question about like caching, I don't know why that's on my mind. You might know something else about like another like caching tool, or you might actually know something else about how memory management works, that kind of thing. So that's kind of like one way that you can actually concretely action on things like that. Yeah, Tom says that he loved asking for a minute. It's helped to communicate. So yeah, highly recommend that. It comes highly recommended by lots of great people.
I love all that advice that you just gave. That was fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah, interviewing for me, it feels like it's just like one of those things that like holds people back, but it's the last thing that should. So yeah, if anybody has any other questions after this, feel free to reach out to Anne or myself. I think with that, we can probably call it to a close for today. Caroline should have some resources for the Career Accelerator group. So if you're interested in joining that, Caroline, do you want to drop a link in the chat, or do you have another, or you can reach out to people through Eventbrite, right?
Yeah, definitely. So everyone registered for today's event is now going to be receiving the Career Accelerator newsletter. So you'll be notified every time we have another Imposter Syndrome event, which is awesome. And then I'll also just throw my email in the chat in case any of you have any questions about Lighthouse or our programs. And I also just put in the Career Accelerator email if you're looking for those previous recordings. But on my end, thank you so much, Anne. That was really great. And I think everyone got a lot of value out of everything you shared. And thank you again, Miriam and Dyspatch, for hosting today.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.